and Mrs. Job. We've been able to redeem Eve a little bit. We've been able to forgive Mrs. Lot. So let's think about Mrs. Job for a minute. I love that it's just Mrs. Job. So, I served a church sometime back when I went to look at the membership books to think about, who had belonged and do those year-end reports like we're doing, make sure we have all the members on the books that we're supposed to be. These books in this church, at this particular period of time, all the women in them were identified like this. It'd be looking along the ledger and it'd say, Mrs. Henry Callahan joined on February 2nd, 1956. Okay. Or Mrs. George Denton joined, in 1947. How frustrating it was. I would hear stories about Mildred or Betty or Irma, and I would go back to the church records and be looking for some little, connection about who she was in the church, and I find Mrs. George Denton. Well, was that Betty? Was that Irma? I don't know. I can't tell. She wasn't identified. And it really took some investigative skills to try to uncover who the women really were and who they were in the life of the church, what they had done and who they'd been. It was difficult and interesting and very, of course, patriarchal. I just thought that was... Of course, there was a male pastor at the time that was writing all of that down. Well, the book of Job, where we find Mrs. Job, is a poetic piece of wisdom literature, if you will. It's more like, for me, one of Jesus' parables than it is some of the other things that we find in the First Testament. And the whole thing, the whole story, the whole crux of Job is all set up in the first couple of chapters, some of which we have read this morning. Imagine the scene like you would see in, Law and Order, okay? The old ones, not the specialty ones. I don't watch those. I like the old-fashioned, the good old Law and Order, the original stuff. The heavenly beings have gathered in the courtroom. Perhaps they're a jury of sorts. I don't really know, but they're all there gathered before God, who presumably is the judge, right? That's the classic role that God would play. And we have an appearance by this adversary. At least that's what the Common English Bible calls him. In Hebrew, he would have been called the accuser or the Satan. Yeah, Satan is the way we would pronounce that sometimes today. And then, of course, also present in the courtroom are Job and his story, and Mrs. Job is a part of the drama, and a few of Job's really good friends. That rounds out the whole cast. But this trial, this courtroom drama, is not about sin and punishment. That's what we would expect from the Old Testament and the classic drama scenes, is that someone has sinned and there's going to be guilt and there's going to be a confession and there's going to be punishment. No, it's not about that. It's about something much, much larger and much, much more difficult to talk about. The very nature of human suffering. That's what the drama is about in Job. And the questions that it causes us to ask. For instance, why do good people like Job suffer? Why does God allow catastrophes like earthquakes and tornadoes and fires? Why does God allow tragedies, tragic deaths and calamities? Is this horrible suffering that I'm a part of in this time, is this some sort of test? Am I being tested by God? And will I pass? Or will I fail? What did I do to deserve this suffering? You probably have your own version of the questions that I've been lifting up. And over generations of time, people have turned to Job for answers. They've turned to this book of the Bible. They've turned to his situation. They've returned to his courtroom drama, his trial, and in an attempt to make some sense or find any kind of meaning or hope, if there is any, in suffering. And if you weren't really looking for Mrs. Job, you might miss her and her one big moment. Chapter 2, verse 9. This is it. She's got one line, one part to play, and she does it well. Remember the question? Why do you persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. Her big one line. That's it, right there. Her bad rap. Okay? That was it in those few words. She has been described, because she said that, as faithless. She's been described as callous. She's been described as uncaring and cold and possibly evil. Because really, isn't she siding with the Satan, the accuser, the adversary? Isn't she hoping that Job will just give up and go on? And what some others might see as an unsympathetic question, in that I find an important one for anyone who claims to follow God. Why do you persist in being loyal to God? I think that's a good question. I think that's an important question. It's not about deservedness. It's not about fairness. It's not about who God is or what God is doing. Her question is about Job. It's to Job. It's about his faith. It's about his belief, for his integrity. And for that, she's vilified. If you hang around enough 12-step groups, like I have, you pick up certain phrases, okay, about relationships in life and how we live. And some of those you probably heard. There's let go and let God. That's a good one. I often try to remember that because I'd like to do things on my own and figure everything out, control it all, but no, I can't. I need to let go. There's one day at a time. That's the name of a little devotional book that I used for years. Each page with a little devotion that helped me remember to not worry about some of the larger issues, because I just can't control those things, but to take each day as it comes and to deal with what's there in front of me. You know the phrase, keep it simple? Yeah, that's an old 12-step saying, keep it simple. And then for me, the one that most applies to integrity is that a person should talk the talk until you can walk the walk. You ever heard that? Talk the talk until you can walk the walk. John Wesley said a variation on that. He said, preach faith until you have it. And then because you have it, you will preach faith. Something like that. At least it's accredited to John Wesley. That's the way I learned it. The problem with me and that little saying is that I can't tell the difference between someone who's just talking and someone who's really walking, right? I got caught up into a relationship with a guy who thought he was talking big talk, but he really wasn't walking the walk. That was really tough. And Mrs. Job is turning this whole story around, It's not God who's testing Job. It's Mrs. Job and all of us asking, do you do integrity or do you have integrity? Are you talking or are you really walking? It's a far more important question in suffering than why me. I think it's far more important than a lot of the other questions. I think this one, who am I going to be in the midst of suffering, is especially important in this day and age of the church. Will Job abandon his God? Will we? Will Job move on and abandon his God and choose another God that just might bless him instead? Well, he had lots of choices. There's Astarte, the fertility god. Maybe he could go and pray to that one. There's Marduk, the sun god. And maybe he could go and pray to that one. Maybe he could go to the Canaanite goddess, Asherah, and see if he could get a blessing from her, if life would go any better. Or maybe he could just give up religion altogether. I don't know if you've ever known anyone who's done that. I know far too many who've just given up on religion. Who wouldn't, right? If you're the one in the hospital room in the wee hours of the morning and everyone's gone and it's just you and the tubes and the morphine pump, if you're the one left at the graveside with nothing but some flowers blowing in the wind, if you're the one alone on the battlefield, if you're the one in a drafty, run-down motel room, or maybe you're in an upscale, custom-built home in the suburbs, people have given up on religion because they've suffered. People have moved on to other gods too. You know them: wealth and success and materialism and, gods of relationships, gods of self or self-absorption, gods of oppression and injustice, pitting us against them. Let's worship that God and play that game. Gods who still cling to those very, very ancient, misguided beliefs that, well, if you are suffering, you must deserve it. Surely you've done something. For those people who have walked away from religion, who've given up, Mrs. Job's question and the rest of the story that answers her question is extremely important in my book. Because it tells of the God who is not pointing fingers and saying, you're going to hurt and you aren't, and you're going to be blessed, but you're not. It tells of a God who created the universe and everything in it and then called it good. It tells of the God who loves us. All of us created in God's image, and that is all of us. There isn't one who escapes that. The story that tells people who care enough to say that we walk the talk, we do more, we make a difference in the world daily. It's a question that the real religious folk of our time can ask one another, so we can call each other to accountability in regards to our faith, in regards to our belief, in regards to our behavior. Are we talking or are we walking? And that's it. One little question and Mrs. Job's gone. It's like that little tiny town. If you blink, you've missed it. That's her question. And Job, throughout the rest of the book, gets to shine. He gets to uphold his integrity. Even in the midst of suffering, he gives hope to all of us who have questioned God. Mrs. Job gives us permission to hold each other accountable, to ask deep questions of faith. God can take it. Go ahead. She gives us permission to walk the walk and to keep faith. Amen.